Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I was 28. The winter I moved back to the mountains, licking my wounds from the kind of breakup that makes you feel like you've been cut in half. After 6 years with the same woman in Raleigh, I found myself back in a small rented A-frame on the side of a ridge in western Appalachia, outside a town that had one stoplight, 3 churches, and more shuttered storefronts than open ones. I worked remotely as a financial analyst for a logistics company based 3 states away, which sounded more impressive than it felt. Most days it was just me, spreadsheets, the hum of my space heater, and the constant awareness of the woods pressing in on all sides. Once the novelty of the quiet wore off, the silence got loud in ways I hadn't expected. The only thing that made me feel even remotely connected to the outside world was my phone, and before long I was doing the same thing everyone does when they don't know what to do with their loneliness. I downloaded the apps. Swiping on faces from counties I'd barely heard of became part of my nightly routine. I told myself I was just looking for someone to get coffee with, someone to drive into town with for dollar wings on Thursdays, someone whose presence would make the cabin feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. That's how I matched with a girl named Lena. Her profile said she was 26, born and raised in these hills, and the pictures were a mix of filters, low lighting, and flannel. We traded a handful of messages. Nothing special. And then it fizzled out into the usual limbo. She watched every story I posted but never replied, a little glowing circle of attention that never turned into anything real. I'd seen that pattern in the city too, but out here it felt more pathetic somehow, like I was shouting into a canyon and only hearing my own echo. It was early December when she finally resurfaced. I'd posted a story of the cabin at dusk, the ridge out back dusted with the season's first snow and a cheap string of warm white lights around the porch railing. I'd captioned it something about mountain Christmas vibes, because I was bored and trying too hard. A few minutes later, Lena replied, saying the cabin looked cozy and that she loved Christmas, that she hadn't decorated yet and wished she had a tree to put up. We started chatting for real this time. She liked old holiday movies, hated eggnog, said she worked nights sometimes and slept weird hours. When I mentioned I had a fake tree still boxed up in the little loft space above my bedroom, she said it was tragic. I hadn't put it up yet and suggested, almost too quickly, that she could come over and help. I hesitated. Out here, people talk a lot about being careful who you let up your road, and I'd only been in the cabin a few months. At the same time, the thought of another night alone with Netflix and instant ramen made my skin crawl. It was a Wednesday. My work was done for the day. The snow was supposed to pick up overnight, and something in me wanted a story to tell that wasn't about spreadsheets or heartbreak. I told her she could come by around 9. The sun had already disappeared behind the ridge when we made the plan, the sky turning that bruised purple that comes before true dark. It was only 7:30 though. So I grabbed my keys, stepped out onto the porch, and immediately noticed the first thing that should have bothered me more than it did. The motion light above the steps, which had been working fine the night before, was dead. I tapped the fixture, flipped the switch inside a couple of times. Nothing. I told myself the bulb had probably just blown, made a mental note to dig around for a spare in the hall closet, and drove the 10 winding miles into town to pick up a couple bottles of cheap red from the only grocery store still open. When I got back, the woods were a solid wall of black beyond the faint halo of my headlights. As I stepped out of the car, I heard a branch snap somewhere off to my left, just beyond where the driveway disappeared into trees. It sounded like someone putting their weight in the wrong place. I froze, keys in my hand, and listened. Nothing. No second crack, no crunch of leaves, just the distant rush of the creek down in the hollow and the tick of my cooling engine. Deer, I told myself, because everything in these parts gets blamed on deer, and walked to the door a little faster than usual. Inside, I went into a kind of frantic hosting mode. I vacuumed the area rug, wiped down the counters, stacked the dirty dishes in the sink out of sight, and lit the only candle I owned that didn't smell like a college dorm. Living alone had taught me how quickly a place could go from cozy to feral if you stopped paying attention for even a week. I put on some jazz playlist, dimmed the lights, and set the wine out on the coffee table like I did this kind of thing all the time. 9 o'clock came and went. I sat there on the couch, doing that thing where you pretend to be engrossed in whatever's on TV, even though you're really just staring at your phone every 30 seconds. I texted her to let me know when she was on her way. No read receipt. The longer I waited, the more I noticed small things I'd been ignoring. The draft coming from under the door, the way the trees brushed the side of the cabin like fingers. The fact that my closest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road and probably asleep. At 9:30, my phone buzzed. Here. No driveway sounds. No headlights through the window. Just that one word. Before I could overthink it, there was a knock at the door. 3 quick raps, confident, like she'd been there before. I opened it and immediately had to adjust what I'd imagined. Lena was taller than I expected, a couple inches taller than my 5 to 10, even without the heavy boots she had on. She was bundled in a dark coat, a knit hat pulled low, her hair sticking out in dry, uneven ends that looked like they'd been cut in a bathroom mirror. The first thing that hit me, though, was the smell. A thick, cheap floral perfume that didn't cover the faint, sour edge of old sweat. Up close, under the porch light that still stubbornly refused to come on, I saw that she looked a little older than 26. There were faint lines at the corners of her mouth, and her knuckles were bruised and red. The skin split in a way I recognized from a friend who'd worked in a warehouse and punched walls on bad days. That was the second thing that should have bothered me. I pushed it away, stepped aside, and let her in. She moved straight to the couch like she'd already decided where to sit, dropping down close enough that her thigh pressed against mine when I joined her. The contact felt too intimate, given we'd technically just met, but I didn't say anything. Up close, I noticed other details. The faint tremor in her hands when she unzipped her coat, the bitten-down nails with grime underneath, a faint, almost metallic smell on her breath that reminded me of an ER waiting room. I asked if she wanted wine, grateful for something to do, and she said please without looking at me, her eyes drifting around the cabin like she was taking inventory. As I poured, I caught the edge of her reflection in the microwave door. Her head tilted slightly as she looked down the short hallway toward the bathroom and bedroom. Eyes narrowed like she was measuring distances. We made small talk over the first glass. Where we'd gone to school, what we did for work, how long we'd been on the app. Her answers were vague. She helped out at a store in town sometimes, watched her cousins, kids, had done a little bit of everything. She didn't ask many follow-up questions about me, but when I mentioned, offhand, that my doctor had put me on something for anxiety after the breakup, she perked up just enough to ask what it was and if it helped. It felt like the kind of oversharing people do these days, so I didn't think much of it. When I handed her a fresh glass, she clinked it against mine with a shaky cheers. And within seconds, a dark splash of red bloomed on the light gray fabric of my couch. My stomach flipped. I heard the old version of myself, the one who spent weekends in West Elm, wanting to scream. But instead I forced a laugh and said it was fine, grabbing a towel and some cleaner from under the sink. While I was in the kitchen, I glanced toward the door, and for just a second, in the reflection of the oven glass, I thought I saw the shape of someone standing on the porch, still and dark, behind the thin curtain. When I turned around, the window was empty. I told myself it was my own reflection and went back to blotting the stain, heart beating faster than a little spill warranted. To break the tension, I said we should get the tree out of the loft. The ladder to the loft pulled down from the ceiling in the hallway, and I always hated climbing it. Something about the way it wobbled as you got higher. The feeling of being suspended between the small safety of the cabin and the bigger emptiness above. I tugged the cord, unfolded the ladder, and climbed up into the dusty space where Id tossed any box I didn't feel like unpacking when I moved in. There was no light switch up there, just a bare bulb I had to pull on with a little chain. As the light flickered on, I heard something downstairs, the the faint sound of a cabinet door opening, then another, like someone exploring. I called out that the tree box was heavier than it looked, and Lena's voice floated back, too bright, saying she was just looking around, which could have meant anything. I found the long cardboard box with the fake pine tree in it, dragged it to the edge of the opening, and lowered pieces down to her. She took each section with what felt like unnecessary force, snatching them from my hands. When I lowered the biggest piece, the base, she handled it like it weighed nothing. I remember thinking she was stronger than she looked. Back downstairs, we assembled the tree in the corner by the front window. I put on some old holiday playlist and poured us both more wine. My tolerance has never been great, but I've been drunk enough times to know what it feels like when your body starts to let go. This was different. By the time I finished my second glass, there was a slow, syrupy heaviness spreading from my scalp down my shoulders, like someone was steadily turning down the dimmer switch behind my eyes. The room didn't spin exactly, it just softened at the edges. I assumed it was stress, maybe the altitude, maybe the fact I'd barely eaten all day. I told Lena I needed to grab the box of ornaments from the little crawl space under the stairs. She told me she'd hold down the fort, a phrase that stuck with me later because of how casually she said it. The crawl space door was at floor level, a small wooden panel I had to pull off to crawl into the low, dusty area that extended beneath the kitchen. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and squeezed inside. It smelled like cold dirt and old insulation. As I shuffled toward the back where Id shoved the plastic bin of Christmas stuff my mom had insisted I take from her attic, the dizziness intensified. My heart started beating faster in that hollow way that makes you aware of every thump. I had to sit for a second, my knees pressing into the cold plywood, my head buzzing like a TV left on static. Somewhere above me, a drawer slammed, then another. It didn't sound like someone casually looking for a lighter or a coaster. It sounded like someone searching with urgency. I called out, asking if everything was okay, my voice sounding thick and far away to my own ears. She called back something about just looking for the bathroom. But Id left the bathroom door open, the light on. She would have seen it from the couch. The disconnect made my skin crawl. I told myself again I was overreacting, grabbed the bin, and hauled it toward the crawl space opening. By the time I got it back into the living room, my legs felt like they had cement poured into them. Lena was nowhere in sight. The bathroom was empty. The bedroom door was halfway open, the light off. I checked it, checked the tiny coat closet by the door, checked the kitchen like maybe Shed decided to surprise me by doing the dishes. Nothing. I pulled my phone out to text her and realized I was moving slower than my own thoughts. My fingers felt thick and clumsy on the screen. I sent a quick, "Where'd you go?" on the app, but it just sat there, undelivered. That's the last clear memory I have before everything went dark. There wasn't the usual slide into sleep, no half-dreams or awareness of changing positions. One second I was sitting down on the couch because my knees suddenly didn't trust themselves. The next second, or what felt like the next, I was waking up in a room that didn't look like mine at all. The TV was off. The candle had burned down to a sad little puddle of wax. The only light came from my phone, which was face down under my hip. My mouth tasted like metal and cotton. My tongue felt slightly numb. When I lifted the phone and the screen flared bright in the dark, I saw that it was 1:14 a.m. and that it had been out for almost 3 hours. I also saw something else. Even though the phone's light was aimed at my face, there was just enough spill into the room that I could make out a shape at the edge of it. The outline of a tall figure standing between the TV and the front window, too still to be anything but intentional. For a second, my brain tried to file it under coat rack, lamp, shadow, anything but person, but the proportions were wrong. Shoulders, head, the slightest shift of weight from one foot to the other. My first instinct should have been to scream, but whatever was still in my system wrapped that instinct in cotton and pushed it down. My limbs were heavy, slow to respond. I put the phone back down, almost gently, plunging the room into darkness again, like maybe if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. After a moment that stretched too long, I managed to say her name into the dark, my voice cracking. "Lena?" No answer. Just breathing that I couldn't be sure wasn't my own. I fumbled for the side button on my phone again, desperate enough to risk the light. The screen came back on, and I quickly flipped to the flashlight, the beam cutting across the living room like a knife. The light landed on her. Lena was standing 3 feet from the coffee table, coat back on, one hand at her side, clutching something I couldn't see clearly, her pupils blown wide in the sudden brightness. Her expression was completely flat, no apology, no surprise, just a blank, assessing stare like I was an equation Shed already mostly solved. Behind her, the front door was cracked an inch open, letting in a thin slice of cold that made the candle smoke curl. For a few seconds we just looked at each other, the only sound the faint ticking of the wood stove cooling down. I tried to push myself upright, but my muscles protested like Eid run a marathon. The effort made the room tilt. All I could manage was her name again, a little louder. Something changed in her eyes then, not guilt, exactly, more like impatience. Without a word, she turned away from the flashlight beam, yanked the front door fully open, and moved faster than I would have thought possible for someone who'd been standing so still. Her boots thudded on the porch boards, then on the steps, then on the gravel, each step echoing up through the thin cabin floor in an ugly, hurried rhythm. The dead motion light stayed dark, leaving her just a shadow cutting across the small square of night I could see through the window before she disappeared into the trees. The door banged once in the wind before settling on the latch. I lay there, listening, every sound amplified. The wind in the bare branches, a distant truck on the state road, some animal moving in the underbrush. No car starting, no tires on gravel. Shed come on foot. It took maybe 20 minutes before I could fully sit up. Longer before I could stand. When I finally got to my feet, I realized my hands were shaking so hard I had to lean on the wall to walk down the hall. The bedroom felt wrong the second I stepped into it, like someone had rearranged the air. Both nightstand drawers were wide open. The top one, where I kept the small orange bottle of anti-anxiety meds and the half-empty prescription painkillers left over from a knee injury in college, was empty. So was the little plastic organizer where I kept my vitamins, the jar of melatonin, even the cheap gas station sleep aids I'd bought on a bad week. The duffel bag in the corner where I kept a backup stash of ibuprofen and cold medicine had been unzipped, its contents scattered like laundry after a search. In the bathroom, the mirrored cabinet above the sink was ajar, toothpaste and deodorant on the counter like someone had moved them and not bothered to put them back. Even the bottle of generic cough syrup under the sink was gone. The only thing that looked untouched was the toothbrush in its cup and the razor on the ledge. Back in the living room, I noticed other details that hadn't registered in my panic. The coat hooks by the door were askew, like someone had ripped a jacket off in a hurry and then changed their mind. The kitchen drawers were open an inch. Silverware shifted. My wallet was still on the counter, cash and cards intact, but the little zippered pouch where I kept a spare key for the cabin was empty. She hadn't wanted my money. Shed wanted my chemicals and my access. My phone buzzed in my hand. The app where we'd matched showed our conversation as unavailable. Her profile picture was replaced by a gray placeholder silhouette. Her name was gone. It was as if Shed never existed there at all. That, more than anything, made the whole night feel unreal, like I'd dreamed her. I called the sheriff's office because there was no local police department. Explained in a hoarse, embarrassed voice that someone he'd met online had come over, that I thought Shed drugged me and stolen every pill in the house. Saying it out loud made me hear how stupid I sounded. A grown man in a cabin in the woods, too lonely to trust his own instincts, letting a stranger into his home because she said she liked Christmas. The deputy who came out was respectful enough not to say that part out loud, but I could see it flicker across his face when he noticed the half-decorated tree and the spilled wine on the couch. He took notes, asked for the name Shed given me, had me show him the now blank app profile. He shined his flashlight around the yard, following a set of footprints that led from the gravel drive around the back of the cabin, past the bedroom window, and down the steep path that cut through the trees to the creek, where they disappeared into a jumble of ice and rock. There were more prints leading up from that same path to the porch, faintly overlapping mine. She hadn't walked up the road. shed come from the woods from below, where the creek carved a narrow, shadowed cut through the hillside. A neighbor's dog barked once in the distance, then went quiet. The deputy told me there'd been a handful of break-ins in the county that year where nothing was taken but prescription meds, that sometimes addiction makes people do desperate things, that it was good he'd woken up at all. He said he'd file a report, talk to some folks, see if anyone recognized the description. But in a place where everyone has a cousin or an ex with a pill problem and half the women my age own the same coat and boots, my odds of seeing her again were slim. After he left, I double-checked the locks on every door and window, knowing, in the pit of my stomach, that locks don't mean much if someone already knows your layout, knows where you sleep, knows the way your floor creaks when you step in front of the bathroom door. When I finally sat back down on the couch, the dark stain from the wine looked like a spreading bruise. The tree stood half-dressed in the corner. Only the lights wound around it, no ornaments, its plastic branches reaching into the dim room like it was waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. I never finished decorating it that year. The boxes of ornaments went back into the crawl space the next morning and stayed there through New Year's. I told my mom I just wasn't feeling festive, which was easier than explaining that Christmas now reminded me less of childhood and more of the way the phone's glow had lit up a stranger's blank face in the dark. I still live in the mountains. I still love the quiet most days. But I got rid of the couch, changed the locks, installed a camera on the porch with its own backup battery so the motion light can't lie to me again. Every winter, when the first snow comes and the woods go that particular kind of silent, I catch myself listening for footsteps on the gravel that aren't mine. Loneliness can make you open the door to people you should probably leave on the other side of a screen. If you've ever ignored that voice in your head because you just wanted someone to sit across from you and share a drink, if you've ever had a date go from awkward to unsettling in ways you only understood later, tell me about it in the comments. I think a lot of us have stories we don't admit out loud until we hear someone else's first. Story 2. I was 8 years old, Christmas Eve. A man in a Santa suit tried to get into our house on the side of a mountain in Appalachia, and sometimes I still wake up at night with the sound of his knuckles on the door echoing in my ears. We lived just outside a tiny town wedged into a narrow valley, the kind of place where the grocery store and the funeral home shared a parking lot, and everybody could tell who you were by the shape of your taillights. Our house sat up a steep gravel drive off a winding 2-lane road, trees pressing in on both sides. The nearest neighbor, a speck of light you could barely see through the branches if you craned your neck just right. We were one of the only Jewish families in a 50-mile radius, which meant that December for us was Hanukkah candles on the kitchen table and the occasional confused Merry Christmas from strangers who meant well but didn't know any different. My dad, David, was a doctor at the small regional hospital down in town, and every year he signed up to work the Christmas shifts. He said it was practical since we didn't celebrate, that it let the other doctors be home with their kids. But I think he also liked the sense of purpose when the rest of the world seemed to pause. My mom, Rachel, used to be the kind of person who baked challah from scratch and labeled everything in the pantry. But by the time I was old enough to notice, she mostly slept. I didn't have the vocabulary for alcoholic yet, only the pattern. Bottles tucked behind cereal boxes, the sour smell when she hugged me too tight, the way her eyes got glassy in the afternoons and she seemed to drift somewhere I couldn't follow. Once it got dark, she was usually on the couch or in her bedroom, unreachable, and my little sister Mia and I had quietly learned not to count on her for much after that point. That particular December had already felt off. A few nights before Christmas Eve, I had noticed a beat-up maroon pickup truck idling at the bottom of our driveway after dark. Headlights off, just a darker shape in the shadows. I watched from the living room window, the glass cold under my fingers, while whoever was inside sat there for what felt like a long time and then backed out and disappeared around the bend in the road. I told myself it was nothing special. People got lost all the time on those back roads, but the image stuck with me like a splinter. On Christmas Eve, the air outside felt heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm but without any clouds to blame. Dad had left just before dusk, still in his scrubs, kissing the top of my head and reminding me that the volunteer fire station was less than 2 miles away if anything ever happened, that the number for 911 was taped next to the phone, that he'd be home in the morning. Mia, who was 5, waved at him from the living room floor, where we were surrounded by crayons, and a cardboard box Wed turned into a pretend spaceship. Mom was in her room with the door barely cracked, the faint glow of the TV flickering on the hallway wall. Her voice soft and slurred when she told us she was just going to rest for a bit. Once the sky went black and the cold really settled in, Mia and I migrated to the living room, the TV filling the silence with some rerun I can't remember now. The only lights on were the lamp by the couch and the electric menorah on the kitchen counter, its little plastic flames casting a weak orange glow. That's when the first knock came. It wasn't tentative. It was solid. 3 firm raps that made the decorative pine cone wreath on the door rattle against the wood. Mia and I both froze. We weren't expecting anyone. Nobody ever came up our driveway without calling first. I muted the TV and listened to the quiet that followed, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly very loud. When the knock came again, I pushed myself off the carpet and walked toward the front door because I was the big brother, and that's what big brothers do, even when their stomachs feel hollow. Our front door had a row of narrow glass panes set into it, and as I got closer, I could see a figure on the other side, the porch light above him buzzing faintly and making a halo in the cold air. He was in a Santa suit, red coat, white trim, hat, the whole thing, and he was holding a bulging sack slung over one shoulder. I remember how out of place he looked on our bare little porch with no decorations, like someone had cut him out of a mall display and pasted him onto our house. When he saw me, he smiled through the glass, a big showy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, and lifted his hand in a little wave. I didn't open the door. Even at 8, I knew better than that. I just stood there, the cold from the glass seeping into the thin skin of my forehead as I pressed closer to see him more clearly. His beard looked cheap, the curls slightly matted around the elastic strap, and up close I could see the red veins in his eyes and the rawness at the edges of his nose, like he'd been out in the cold for too long. Behind him, at the edge of the porch, I noticed something that tugged at a deeper part of my brain. A smear of muddy boot prints, fresh and dark, scattered not just on the steps, but around the side of the house where there was no path, as if he'd already done a slow lap around, testing windows I would later check and find faint smudges on. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging it up and his mouth moved, but I was too far away to hear the words clearly. It was more the shape of them, exaggerated and practiced, that I remember, addressing me as kiddo, promising presents, acting like this was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't unbolt the lock. My chest was tight. We didn't do Santa. We didn't even have a tree. The disconnect made everything in me go on high alert. I backed away from the door and told Mia to go get the phone. Our landline hung on the kitchen wall, a faded yellow with a long, curly cord. I heard her little feet slap against the linoleum as she grabbed it, her voice small but focused as she tried to remember the instructions Dad had given us. The man outside didn't knock again right away. Instead, there was the soft, unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. A slow, patient rattle against the latch, followed by a slight thud as he leaned his weight into it. The fact that he was trying the handle without saying anything, without knocking first again, made my heart drop into my stomach. The lock held, but the whole door shuddered in its frame. Mia's voice trembled as she talked to the 911 operator, explaining that there was a stranger dressed as Santa on our porch trying to get in. I could only hear her side of the conversation, the pauses too long, her answers getting shorter and more confused. The operator must have thought it was a prank, or excited kids reporting a surprise visit. Mia kept glancing at me, eyes wide, until finally she hung up with her mouth pressed into a tight line that didn't look like a kid's expression at all. She said, "This is for real emergencies," Mia whispered, almost angry, and for a moment I felt like the world had tilted, the safety net we'd been promised suddenly full of holes. The knocking came back, harder this time, vibrating through the thin wood, and then there was a pause followed by a different sound altogether. A faint scraping along the siding as if he was dragging something metal against it while he walked slowly toward the side of the house. We didn't have peepholes or cameras. What we had were windows, and suddenly they felt like eyes with their lids forced open. I pictured him peering in at us, moving from one to the next, sizing up the distance to each lock, each latch. The thought made my skin feel too tight. Mia bolted up the stairs to my mom's room, screaming her name, but I knew in my gut that even if Mom woke up, she wouldn't be able to deal with this, not in the state she'd been in earlier, slurring her words in the doorway to the bathroom. For a second, I felt completely alone, like it was just me and my little sister in a house made of cardboard with something larger and meaner circling it. The thing about being 8 is that your understanding of how the world works is a patchwork of half-true facts and misunderstood details, and sometimes that weird combination saves you. Dad had once explained the smoke detectors to me, how they worked, how the fire station down the road would get an alert if something serious happened. I had filled in the gaps incorrectly, assuming that any smoke would summon help like a magic spell. That misunderstanding lit up in my head then like a flare. I ran to the kitchen drawer where we kept the Hanukkah candles and grabbed a fistful, my hands shaking so hard a few fell and rolled under the table. I struck match after match with frantic fingers, lighting the thin white candles until wax dripped onto my knuckles and the smell of sulfur burned my nose, then carried the burning handful to the narrow hallway where the smoke detector was mounted near the ceiling. I knew enough not to set anything on fire, but not enough to have a better plan than this. I blew them all out at once and held the smoking cluster of wicks beneath the detector, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating back onto my face. For a second, nothing happened, and I felt a wave of nausea at the thought that id made everything worse for nothing. Then the alarm shrieked to life. The sound was deafening in the small house, a high, piercing scream that seemed to slice my thoughts into jagged pieces. Mia came tearing down the stairs, eyes wild, and Mom's door opened halfway before she closed it again, mumbling something I couldn't make out. The Santa man stopped moving outside. Under the howl of the alarm, there was suddenly a thick, waiting silence, like the breath you hold before jumping into cold water. Every horror story my classmates had whispered on the bus about people in costumes, kidnappings in parking lots, all of it collapsed into this one moment of raw, animal fear. I dragged Mia into the center of the living room and told her we had to stay away from the windows and doors. Words coming out of me that Ed heard in some safety video at school and now clung to like a script. The alarm kept blaring. I remember staring at the front door and imagining it being kicked in, wood splintering, that red suit filling the doorway, and feeling a kind of numb resignation, like maybe this was how some stories ended, and I'd been naive to think ours would be different. When the fire truck finally pulled into our gravel drive, its siren cutting through the night, it was almost a shock to realize that the world outside our spinning little nightmare still existed. Through the edge of the front window, I saw the flash of red lights reflecting off the bare trees and the wet glint of metal ladders. 2 volunteers in heavy coats and helmets jumped down, moving quickly toward the house. Relief flooded me so fast, my knees wobbled. I grabbed Mia's hand tighter, ready to run to the door, but something in me hesitated. The man in the Santa suit had not disappeared. As the firefighters approached, he stepped out from the corner of the porch where he'd been waiting, just out of sight. Suddenly, right there in their flashlight beams, waving his arms like someone signaling a plane. I don't think he'll ever forget the switch he made in those first seconds. The calculated patient's head shown at the door burned off, replaced by this theatrical panic as he gestured at our house and shouted something I couldn't hear through the door and the alarm. One of the horror elements I still replay is how he pointed at the front door, then at himself, over and over, mouthing words I later learned were him claiming to be our father, trapped outside while his children were inside a burning house. From our angle, we could see the way the firefighters slowed when they took him in the familiar costume. The frantic story, the smoke alarm screaming, and for a terrible moment they looked like they believed him. One put a gloved hand on the doorknob, clearly preparing to force it open if needed. I saw the other glance back at the house briefly, taking in the dark windows, the lack of visible flames, and that small hesitation probably saved our lives. The Santa man stepped closer, his body almost blocking the door, animated in a way that felt rehearsed, one hand gripping the edge of his sack like it was a prop in a play. As he shouted, the sack shifted enough that I could see something glint inside metal, not wrapping paper, and my mind filled in the rest with a horrible clarity. Not toys, not gifts, but tools, maybe a length of rope, maybe something worse. It'd grown up around hunting knives and rifles. I knew the dull shine of steel when I saw it. That was the second detail that still chills me, that I glimpsed what might have been waiting for us if Head gotten through that door. And it was so ordinary, so human, that it made the whole thing scarier than any monster. Without thinking it through, fueled by the kind of fear that overrides every social instinct, I grabbed Mia and dragged her right up to the inside of the door, shouting through it as loud as my lungs would allow. We yelled that he wasn't our dad, that our father was at the hospital, that we were Jewish and didn't even celebrate Christmas, that there was no fire, only a smoke alarm had set off because the police hadn't believed us. The firefighters froze, then looked down and saw our small faces pressed to the glass, our lips moving in frantic bursts. One of them cupped his hands to the pane and told us to back away from the door and not open it no matter what. He then turned to the man in the Santa suit with a different posture entirely, more cautious now, more skeptical, asking questions I couldn't hear but could guess at. There was a tense exchange on the porch, body language tightening. The Santa man's shoulders squared, his gestures got sharper. He seemed to realize Head lost control of the narrative. He started to edge toward the steps like he might bolt. That's when the third horror detail lodged itself in my memory. As he shifted his weight to turn, his fake beard slipped slightly to one side, revealing the lower half of his face, a thin, pale jaw, lips pressed into a hard line, a faint scar running from the corner of his mouth down toward his chin. It was the kind of detail you'd notice if you'd seen someone around town before. Maybe in a maroon pickup idling by the side of the road. Maybe standing too long at the edge of a parking lot. That half-familiarity made him feel less like a random monster and more like something that had been orbiting our lives for days without us realizing it. The firefighters moved faster then. One stepped in front of him, blocking the stairs, while the other radioed for the sheriff's department. There was some brief struggling, bodies colliding in awkward, heavy movements on the small porch, boots slipping on the thin layer of frost. The sack had been clutching, hit the boards with a dull clang, and I watched one of the firefighters instinctively nudge it farther away with his foot. When the deputies arrived, lights bouncing off the trees, they cuffed the man and led him down the steps toward the waiting car. His Santa hat had fallen off somewhere in the scuffle, and without it and the beard askew, he looked smaller, almost ordinary. It was horrifying in its own right that someone so plain could have been capable of standing outside a stranger's home and calculating how to get to the children inside. A different deputy stayed with us, stepping into the living room, switching off the howling smoke alarm, making sure there really was no fire, no structural damage. Mom finally emerged from her room in a rumpled t-shirt, eyes bloodshot and unfocused, confused and defensive all at once, asking what was going on as if Wed woken her from a nap instead of dragged her back from the edge of something worse. The deputy spoke to her gently, then asked for the name of the hospital where my dad was working so they could contact him. When Dad finally came home, hours later, there was a tightness to his face I hadn't seen before. A brittle combination of guilt and horror and gratitude. He hugged us both so hard it hurt, then argued with Mom behind a closed door, voices low but edged with something sharp. The grown-up fallout of that night was its own kind of slow-motion disaster. But in the years since, what has stuck with me most is not the fight or the court dates or the rumors that swirled through our small town after word got out. It's the memory of that man on our porch, and the layered realization that if we had celebrated Christmas like everyone assumed, if Wed had a tree and stockings and parents waiting eagerly for Santa, we probably would have opened the door, and the story might not have had an ending I could sit here and tell. Being Jewish didn't just make us different that night. It made me suspicious enough, stubborn enough, to question a red suit and a sack of presents at my door. It made me yell the truth loud enough for someone outside to hear. I think about that sometimes when December rolls around and people talk about holiday magic and miracles. Our miracle was entirely human, a misunderstanding about smoke detectors, a skeptical firefighter, a kid who refused to open the door even when the person on the other side was dressed like every commercial on TV. If you've ever had a moment where your gut told you something was wrong, even when everyone else thought you were overreacting, if you've ever looked back and realized how close you came to the edge without knowing it at the time, I'd honestly like to hear it. Share your story in the comments. because sometimes knowing other people have lived through those almost nightmares makes the old fear a little easier to carry. Story 3. It was December, a couple of years ago, when my girlfriend and I decided to trade city noise for the quiet of the Appalachian Mountains. And I don't think either of us really understood what quiet meant until we were standing on that narrow gravel road, looking up at a cabin that felt like it was hanging off the side of the ridge. My name is Ryan. Hers is Emma. And at the time we lived in Charlotte, buried in constant traffic and office notifications and the kind of low-grade stress you don't notice until you finally step away from it. We booked an Airbnb that was advertised as a Christmas hideaway in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. A 2-bedroom cabin with a wraparound deck, a hot tub, a view of the valley, and more Christmas decorations than a department store window. The listing photos made it look ridiculously cozy, tree already up, stockings on the stone fireplace, lights strung through the trees like some Hallmark movie set. The host, a guy named Caleb, messaged to say snow was supposed to roll in that night, so he recommended getting there early and stocking up. That sounded perfect to us. Get in, get groceries, cook, watch movies, sit in the hot tub while snow fell, pretend real life didn't exist for a weekend. We left before noon and watched the world get thinner and more wooded the farther we drove, billboards giving way to rusted trailers and church signs, 4 lanes narrowing to 2, then to 1.5. By the time we turned onto the final mountain road, my cell service was cutting in and out, and the sky had that flat gray look that means daylight is going to disappear a lot faster than you think. The cabin's driveway was steep, twisting through bare trees until it opened onto a little clearing with the house sitting at the edge like it was guarding the drop-off. There were plastic candy canes lining the front steps, an inflatable snowman half deflated and leaning sideways, and warm white lights along the deck railing already glowing in the late afternoon gloom. As I stepped out of the car, the air hit me cold and clean in a way you don't get in the city, with that faint smell of wood smoke carried up from somewhere lower on the mountain. It should have felt idyllic, and part of it did, but there was something else that tugged at me too. A quiet I wasn't used to, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. While Emma stretched her legs and took pictures, I walked up to the deck to punch in the lockbox code Caleb had sent. That's when I noticed the first thing that made my stomach sink, even though I didn't fully process it until later. A single line of muddy boot prints on the deck boards that didn't match mine, half filled with icy slush, leading not from the steps to the door like you would expect, but from the far corner of the deck to the big front window and then back again, like someone had stood there for a while looking in before circling away. On the railing, right where a person would have rested their elbow, a cigarette butt was mashed into the wood, still faintly stained yellow at the filter. There was no smell of smoke anymore, just that little physical fact that said we weren't the first ones to visit the cabin that day. I told myself it had to have been some maintenance guy or a neighbor checking on things, brushed it off, and opened the door. Inside, the place was exactly what Wed hoped for. Warm, smelling like cut pine and something slightly sweet, probably the fake cinnamon candle on the coffee table. A modest Christmas tree glowed in one corner, already decorated with mismatched ornaments. Stockings hung on the stone fireplace, labeled Joy, Peace, and Noel. There was a little kitchen with butcher block countertops and a fridge that hummed louder than it should have in the stillness. A loft upstairs held a pool table and a couch under a skylight, and a narrow staircase led down to a basement that, when I checked it out, felt more like a concrete utility space than any kind of hangout, a washer and dryer. The hot water heater, exposed pipes, a bare bulb throwing harsh light and deep shadows. It was colder down there. The kind of cold that felt like it was seeping up from the ground rather than just a lack of heat. When I came back up, I noticed Emma had already arranged our stuff in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, leaving the one at the back of the house for sleeping since it faced the woods and felt more private. I helped unload groceries, found the pots and pans we needed, and did the usual Airbnb inspection, checking for extra blankets, making sure the doors locked, testing the heat. Everything worked fine. But when I turned the deadbolt on the sliding glass door that led from the living room out to the deck and hot tub, I had to push harder than expected, like it had been used a lot, like it had been opened and closed more than the front door. It was a small thing, barely worth noting, but it registered. Just after we finished putting things away, there was a knock at the door. It sounded sharper than it needed to, each rap precise and firm, echoing in the small house in a way that made both of us look up. I wasn't expecting anyone. Caleb had said he lived in town, not up here. When I opened the door, a man in his late 40s stood on the porch, bundled in gray sweatpants, a faded Carhartt jacket that had seen better days, and a beanie that might once have been navy blue. He had a patchy beard, weather-beaten skin, and a kind of wired energy in his eyes that didn't match the lazy feel of the afternoon. He smiled like we were old friends and said he just wanted to check that we got in okay. He introduced himself as Roy and explained, almost casually, that he ran the place with his brother, Caleb, and lived just up the ridge if we needed anything at all. It took me a second to process that Caleb had never mentioned a brother in his messages, just that he and his wife owned the cabin as a side income, but I tried to be polite. What snagged in my brain wasn't just the brother comment. It was the way Roy said Emma's name without me having introduced her. He glanced past me into the living room and said something like he was glad Emma liked the decorations, nodding toward the tree. She hadn't come to the door. She was still in the kitchen. The only way He'd know her name was if He'd seen our booking details or read our messages, which meant he either really was family to the host or he was someone who'd gotten a little too close to the rental. His eyes skimmed over everything as we talked, the couch, the hallway that led to the bedrooms, the staircase down to the basement, as if he was building a map in his head. He mentioned offhand that the last guests left a mess, and that sometimes people up here forget to lock things, letting the sentence hang in the air. I felt a faint chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I thanked him, said we were all set, and he finally left, walking down the steps and disappearing around the side of the cabin instead of heading back down the driveway, which felt strange enough that I watched through the front window for a moment, expecting to see him reappear on the road. He didn't. Night came on fast. Snow started drifting down, the big lazy flakes that look almost fake under porch lights. We cooked a simple dinner, chicken thighs, potatoes, broccoli, and ate it on the couch with the Christmas tree glowing and some generic holiday movie playing in the background. For a while, it was exactly what Wed wanted. The outside world held at bay by four walls and soft lighting, the sound of wind in the trees muted by thick glass. After Wed digested a bit and opened a bottle of wine, the hot tub seemed like the natural next step. I went out onto the deck, the boards already covered in a thin film of snow, and lifted the cover. Steam curled up into the cold air, swallowing the Christmas lights in a harmless-looking fog. Before climbing in, I walked to the edge of the deck to look out over the valley. The sky was clouded over, but the white of the snow made everything brighter than it should have been, a kind of dim silver that let you see the shapes of trees and rocks without revealing their details. That's when I noticed a second detail that would only really hit me later. In the snow below the bedroom window at the back of the cabin, half hidden by a low rhododendron bush, there was a dark patch of disturbed powder shaped like where someone might have stood for a long time, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Leading away from it, toward the tree line, were faint impressions. Not fresh enough to be sharp, but recent enough that the snow hadn't fully covered them. Someone had been there before the storm picked up. I told myself again that it had to be a previous guest or a hunter passing through and pushed the thought away. When we finally slid into the hot water, it felt incredible, the sting of cold air on our faces, the heat-loosening muscles I hadn't realized were tight, snow landing on our shoulders and melting almost instantly. For a while, we just sat there listening to the hiss of the jets and the low roar of wind in the pines. Then, suddenly, the bubbles stopped. The motor cut out mid-cycle, leaving us in a silence that felt too big for the small deck. We could still hear the wind, the occasional plop of snow sliding off a branch, but without the constant noise of the tub, another sound emerged. The faint crunch of footsteps in snow coming from somewhere around the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't care if they were heard, but didn't want to hurry either. The third horror detail is seared into my memory. In that same breath of silence, just after the crunching stopped, there was the distinct click of something that sounded very much like a phone camera shutter. That little artificial sound that's supposed to mimic an old film camera. It came from beyond the deck railing, from the dark just out of sight. Every hair on my arms stood up. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Emma's hand tightened on my arm under the water. I didn't say anything. I just reached out slowly, trying not to make the water slosh, and hit the button to turn off the remaining tub lights, plunging us into near darkness. We sat there, half submerged, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps started again a few moments later, circling the cabin, crunching closer to the backside where the bedroom was, then fading toward the opposite slope. We didn't call out, didn't ask who was there. Some instinct deeper than courtesy told me that if someone was walking around a rental cabin at night during a snowstorm and taking pictures, they weren't going to be reassured by manners. After a few long minutes of silence, my muscles started to shake from tension as much as from cold, and we rushed out of the tub, grabbed our towels, and hurried inside, locking the sliding glass door with fingers that didn't feel entirely steady. The hot water in the shower barely lasted 2 minutes before it went icy. We yelped and jumped out, our breath puffing in the cold air of the small bathroom. I wrapped myself in a towel and grabbed my phone, messaging Caleb through the app. He responded fairly quickly, apologizing and saying that was strange, that a local guy he used for maintenance could swing by in the morning to check the hot water heater. He didn't mention Roy by name, just my guy. I almost replied to ask if that guy had been up earlier, if he drove a maroon pickup or wore a faded jacket, but it was late and I didn't want to sound paranoid. We went to bed in the back bedroom, double-checking the window lock and closing the thick curtains. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the snowflakes hitting the glass made a soft tapping sound that almost masked the more distinct noises, the occasional shift of the deck boards as the temperature dropped, the creak of the house settling, the distant rush of a stream down in the hollow. We lay there for a while, whispering about how weird the footsteps around the hot tub had been, but eventually fatigue won. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of someone hitting the front door. It wasn't just knocking. It was the kind of pounding you feel in your ribs, heavy and angry. 3 or 4 blows in quick succession, then silence, then more. Emma jolted awake too, eyes wide in the dim light from the digital alarm clock. I could feel my heart hammering against the mattress. Every instinct I had was split between wanting to see who it was and wanting to pretend we weren't there at all. The pounding happened again, followed by the faint rattle of a doorknob. Wed locked it. I remembered that much. But locks are just objects, and objects fail. We both held our breath, listening for a voice. Some explanation shouted through the wood, but there was nothing. Just that ugly, insistent sound, and then, more chillingly, a lighter, almost testing series of rattles coming from the back of the house as well, where the sliding door was. It was as if someone was moving from entrance to entrance, checking every possible way in. I got up just enough to quietly walk over and lock the bedroom door, feeling ridiculous and yet somehow slightly safer behind that flimsy barrier. After what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, the pounding stopped. We stayed upright in bed, whispering, adrenaline making time stretch. Eventually, just like the night before when the hot tub had gone silent, the house settled into its usual noises again. When dawn finally seeped in around the edges of the curtains, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The snow outside was deeper, smoothed over, a blank sheet that showed any disturbance clearly. I stepped outside to brush off my car and saw exactly what I'd both expected and dreaded. Fresh footprints leading up the driveway, curving around the side of the cabin, circling the deck, and stopping directly under our bedroom window before looping back toward the tree line instead of heading down the road. Near the edge of the clearing, by a cluster of rocks where someone would have had a clear view of the hot tub, an empty beer can lay half buried in the snow, silver and blue against the white. It was crushed in that careless way people do when they're finished, and not worried about anyone seeing the evidence. I snapped a picture almost automatically, my hands shaking, then heard the crunch of new footsteps behind me. For a split second, I thought whoever had been there in the night had come back. But when I turned, it was Roy, walking up from the far side of the cabin, gloved hands in his jacket pockets, that same too bright energy in his eyes. He greeted me like nothing was wrong and said Caleb had asked him to take a look at the hot water heater. He said it like a favor, like he was doing us a kindness, but there was something in the way he looked at me, head tilted just slightly, that made it feel more like a test of how much he could get away with. I mentioned the banging on the door in the middle of the night and the footprints. He shrugged and said there were strange folks in the area who sometimes wandered around, that it was no big deal, that people came up from town to drink and poke around cabins looking for parties. The way he dismissed it felt rehearsed, like Head said those words before. He stepped inside before I could really decide if I was okay with it, said he knew where the basement was, and disappeared down the stairs. The floor above the basement vibrated slightly with his movements. Something in my gut twisted. I pulled out my phone and messaged Caleb, telling him that Roy was there and asking if that was the maintenance guy Head mentioned. The reply came back almost immediately, and it was just one short question. Who's Roy? Ice ran through me in a way the December air hadn't managed. I typed that there was a man here who said he was Caleb's brother and that they ran the place together, that Head stopped by yesterday and again today. There was a pause, then another message. I don't have a brother. Please leave the house and call me. I didn't show the screen to Emma right away. I just walked into the bedroom and told her as calmly as I could that we needed to pack fast. There was no dramatic moment, no screaming. It was just two people moving quicker than they ever had, stuffing clothes into bags, scooping toiletries off the bathroom sink, grabbing chargers and wallets. The whole time, I was hyper-aware of the hollow sound of footsteps in the basement below us, the occasional thud that could have been a toolbox or could have been something else entirely. I pictured him down there, standing by the water heater, listening to our movements, knowing exactly where we were in the house. We managed to get everything to the front door in one trip. When I opened it, the cold air felt like a shock, a slap that jarred me into even clearer urgency. We loaded the car quickly, my eyes flicking from the driveway to the cabin, half expecting Roy to appear in the doorway or at a window. When I finally slid behind the wheel and started the engine, I checked the rearview mirror and saw him then, not in the doorway, but coming around the side of the cabin toward the driveway, moving faster than he had at any point since we met him. His jacket unzipped, something dark in his hand that I couldn't identify from that distance. His mouth was open like he was calling something out, but with the windows up and the heat blasting, I couldn't hear a word. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I put the car in drive and eased down the steep hill more slowly than my instincts told me to, because the last thing I wanted to do was slide off the mountain in a panic. At the bottom of the drive, when we turned onto the narrow road, my hands were shaking so badly I had to tell myself out loud to focus on the curves. Once we were a few miles away and my phone picked up service again, we called Caleb. He told us the sheriff's department had already been notified, and that he was on his way up to the cabin to meet them. His voice was tight, a mix of anger and fear and apology. Head never heard of anyone matching Roy's description, but Head noticed small things around the property lately. Trash in the woods that wasn't from guests, cigarette butts on the deck, tools moved in the basement, and had brushed them off as kids cutting through. Now he wasn't so sure. Later that evening, he messaged to say the deputies hadn't found anyone at the cabin when they arrived. The basement showed signs of being rifled through, but nothing obvious was missing. The hot water heater, naturally, was working fine. The beer can by the rocks and the footprints had been half obliterated by continuing snow by the time they took a look. They'd patrol the area more regularly, Caleb said. He would install additional cameras, change the locks, maybe even stop renting during the winter. He was sorry, he kept saying, as if any of this had been his intention. What made my skin crawl, more than anything, was the slow dawning realization that this man, whoever he really was, had likely been watching the cabin long before we got there. Maybe slipping onto the deck in the evenings to peek in, maybe standing in the woods, listening to couples laugh in the hot tub, learning the routines of different guests. He had studied the house, the schedule, the vulnerabilities. He knew where the basement door was, how the locks felt, how much noise the decks made underfoot. We weren't special to him. We were just the latest weekend booking. I still think about the way the hot tub jets cut out at the exact moment the footsteps came into focus, the soft click of that camera shutter in the dark, the half-burying of a boot print under our bedroom window. I think about how half a tank of hot water and a thin bedroom door were the only barriers between us and a stranger who knew our names and our layout, and the fact that no one would be close enough to hear us if we screamed. I haven't sworn off cabins or the mountains, but indifferent now. I read every review 3 times. I ask hosts direct questions. I walk the perimeter of any place we stay and look for signs that someone else has already been there when they shouldn't. And every time I see a listing promising total seclusion, a small part of me remembers how that felt from the inside. If you've ever had a rental or hotel stay that went from charming to unsettling in ways you only recognized afterward, if you've ever felt watched where you were supposed to feel safe, share it in the comments. I think a lot of us have stories like that, and saying them out loud is sometimes the only way to convince ourselves we didn't just imagine the danger.